Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today we are actually talking about big tech because big tech is stealing intellectual property with almost no consequences. Now, this is coming from a really interesting opinion piece in TechCrunch by Adam Mossoff, and I think it's worthy of a discussion and worthy of your read. Much of what I'm about to say here in my notes is verbatim almost from Adam Mossoff, or I am directly quoting him or paraphrasing him heavily, and obviously I'll give my opinion afterwards. Now, here's what's going on. The U.S. International Trade Commission ruled on January 6th that Google infringed Sonos' patented innovations in wireless speaker technology. Now, this may sound like an obscure legal ruling about a complicated fight over intellectual property, but it confirms a problem that threatens America's innovation economy as well as its international economic competitiveness, and that problem is intellectual property theft. And to quote directly, and that a lot of that was a good quote, but to quote directly Mr. Mossoff, and I quote, "Years ago, big tech companies like Google decided that they profit more by stealing smaller companies' intellectual property than buying or licensing it. Google, Apple, Samsung, and others, with cash reserves in the tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars, do not sweat legal fees, court costs, or even damages they might have to pay for this theft. Google has reported 142 billion in cash in the bank. This is far beyond what most companies make in total annual profits." Now, that is a really interesting quote. And obviously, that's a huge problem. If you have massive cash reserves, and Apple, and you can Google this, at one point had more cash on hand than the US government did, which is somewhat of a terrifying and interesting prospect. But that is a huge thing. If they've got the resources, they can fend these things off and still steal intellectual property, essentially with impunity. Now, here's the logic that Mr. Mossoff has on this, and I quote again, "Big tech thus takes what it wants. It then uses scorched earth litigation tactics to beat up on complaining IP owners or intellectual property owners. It drags out litigation over many years and imposes massive litigation costs on intellectual property owners seeking justice. Many intellectual property owners don't even file a lawsuit. They know it's ruinous and self-defeating to even try to protect what is rightfully theirs. Essentially, big tech is benefiting from stealing intellectual property." Now, the money they spend on legal costs and potential damages, even after years of litigation, is basically a drop in the bucket compared to the profits that they're making off of this theft. Mr. Mossoff also continues on about the nuts and bolts of the situation between Sonos and Google in TechCrunch, and I think that's a great and interesting read. I'm not going to basically regurgitate that here. I really think you should go read that article, but I will leave you with his parting words here, or rather, not his parting words, but a lot of his thoughts on this, and I think these are actually really good points. And I quote, "Sonos is just one prominent example of big tech's illicit use of other people's patented technologies. It is so common it now has a name, predatory infringement. Legal scholars and policy wonks call it quote-unquote efficient infringement. In plain English, this is piracy. Unfortunately, big tech has been attacking America's patent system to further support its piracy. Google and other companies have spent millions over the years lobbying Congress and regulators to weaken and eliminate patents, rigging the system against innovators. For instance, they created the patent troll boogeyman to smear patent owners who sue them for infringement as if the problem was not their own theft, but their victims' gall in fighting back." And I think that's really interesting, because I think there are legitimate patent trolls out there, that essentially buy patents and then they sit on them and then they basically are looking for somebody to use part of that patent to sue. But to this point, basically pumping that up, Google would have that ability. They run the search engine. So I think that this is a huge, huge thing. Mr. Mossoff also goes on to say that essentially Washington, D.C., in other words, Congress and the government needs to step in, really needs to come down hard on these things. And quite frankly, I think he's correct. Part of the issue, obviously, is the massive lobbying scheme that big tech has. They pour a ton of money into lobbyists to make sure that essentially they, for lack of a better term, are buying members of Congress, in some way, shape, or form. We're essentially swaying them to vote the way that they need. But if we're being honest here, we have to look at what we are seeing essentially on the privacy side to get a good look on how we can essentially deal with the patent side. If it's proven that an organization or a massive organization like a Google or a Samsung or whoever has literally infringed on a patent, you can see literally A, created this, and B, they're ripping it off, then there has to be serious consequences and serious fines for that, including things like looking at, let's say, since the or origination of that intellectual property theft, all of the revenue or profitability that the company has made on that, and then transfer to the original patent holder. So if they made $100 billion off of Sonos technology against Sonos's will, and again, I urge you to go read this great article because it's really thought-provoking. Read the issue of, in other words, the nuts and bolts between Sonos and Google. You'll kind of see that Sonos was in bed with Google until they weren't, that they wanted to basically leverage Google, and then they were asking Google, hey, well, license the technology, and Google just ripped it off, basically. Go read the article. And I think that is something that's really important. If Google gets zero, or the threat of them getting zero profit, meaning, great, they made $100 billion using Sonos's technology, but if the law is such where they have to turn over all $100 billion to Sonos, then it's not worth their time. The slap on the wrist of $1 billion is something that they can make back in much less than a quarter in terms of a fiscal year. So this is a huge problem. We do need better regulation. If you look at what's going on the privacy side, as I just mentioned earlier, with things like GDPR and now CCPA in California, companies are really starting to hurt if they are getting these heavy fines for violating your privacy. That should apply to infringement of patents and intellectual property as well. So that is your news of the day. Go read that article. And Adam Mossoff, I agree with you. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well, which is owned by Google, which is apparently stealing intellectual property. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please stay private. Thanks, everyone.